Nick married Jolie 3 years ago. To be honest, he wouldn't have married her if she hadn't become the sole owner of the business after her father's sudden death. Her father, a seemingly young and strong businessman, had died unexpectedly from a stroke. Jolie was Mr. Macmillan's only child and the sole heiress to his fortune. That's why Nick, a handsome slacker who was used to living at the expense of women, paid attention to her. Jolie was captivated by Nick's charming promises while he planned to stay with her until a more profitable opportunity arose. But it soon turned out that the most favorable option, the jackpot of his life, was Jolie. She inherited her father's colossal wealth, and Nick knew exactly how to take advantage of it. He believed he could easily manipulate her deep affection for him to control her fortune, and everything was going as well as possible for Nick. The girl was deeply grieving. Her father had been her pillar of support and the most significant person in her life. So Nick quickly surrounded Jolie with care and support at such a hard time. The young and naive girl was unaware that the worst moment of her life had spurred Nick to hide his true nature even more, at least until their wedding. He maintained his good behavior, ensuring there was no turning back. After the funeral, he proposed marriage. Of course, suggesting they wait until her mourning period for her father was over. Nick was adept at deception, manipulation, and pretense. He could become whoever he needed to be and do whatever was expected of him. With his wealthy girlfriends, he typically didn't put in much effort, thinking there would always be another wealthy woman. But with Jolie, the name was worth it, the efforts would not be in vain, and the cunning man clearly understood it. However, the first hurdle for him came unexpectedly from a source he couldn't have foreseen. Jolie's father had a best friend who was also his main deputy in the company and Jolie's godfather, Mr. Chinland. He immediately understood that Jolie was head over heels in love and wouldn't be dissuaded from marriage. Her grief over losing her father made her seek a replacement. But as an intelligent and shrewd man, Mr. Chinland categorically insisted on the prenuptial agreement, and he managed to win Jolie over to his side. "Nick, it's for business. Is it that hard?" Jolie asked, repeating what Mr. Chinland had told her. "This is humiliating. Do you think I need your money?" Nick retorted, indignant at this turn of events. "Honey, it's just a formality. We only need it in case of divorce. My godfather wants us to sign it. He's always been like a second father to me." Jolie may have been naive about financial matters, given that she'd never had to worry about money, but she wasn't a fool in other respects. When she set a goal, she achieved it no matter what. Nick was pinned against the wall and had to agree to all of Mr. Chinland's terms. The marriage contract formulation was standard, but it curtailed Nick's rights completely. It was evident that the business and all other property inherited from Jolie's father could not become joint property of the spouses. Nick assumed he would receive a share in the dividends and acquire new property and assets. However, the contract drafted by a top-class lawyer prevented Nick from having this opportunity. Despite this, Nick believed the marriage was still beneficial to him as he would access his wife's finances without control and build up capital for the future. He was going to take money from the common budget daily and transfer it to his name. But Nick was mistaken in this regard, too. Mr. Chinland was a dedicated, decent, and responsible person who not only controlled Jolie's financial flows in business, but also her finances. Nick had limited funds for personal expenses, but he remained optimistic about the future and waited to see how the situation would develop. Soon, it turned out that his patience was indeed rewarded. Jolie had been trying to conceive since their wedding day. She desired motherhood. But each new cycle brought bitterness and disappointment. Initially, she attributed it to nerves and stress caused by the frantic pace of life. She took business into her own hands and learned a lot on the go, which was naturally exhausting. After more than a year of unsuccessful attempts, the woman sought help from specialists, underwent a full medical examination, and identified the cause of the failures. Jolie's symptoms, which she had attributed to a busy lifestyle, turned out to be alarm bells her body was warning her of problems, but she had ignored them. Finally, the doctors diagnosed her with cancer. She underwent almost 2 years of treatment and suffering, but with little success. All this time, Nick played the role of the husband only nominally. His vested interest was that Jolie simply did not exist, and he had not managed to hide it well enough. Although they never openly discussed it, Jolie was aware of the numerous women. Her husband had cheated on her with numerous women, but Nick believed he was adept at conspiracy and manipulation. He thought he was successfully playing the role of a dying wife's husband without arousing suspicion. He felt lucky and thought he only needed to endure a little longer to achieve his desired outcome. However, Nick's behavior was condemned and discussed by everyone, from the nurses in the hospitals where Jolie was receiving treatment to Mr. Chinland. The man was furious and helpless. He couldn't comprehend why Jolie would desperately want to preserve her marriage on the brink of the grave. He was also worried that Jolie had no will, and as a result, her husband automatically became her only heir. That scoundrel inherits everything, including the fruits of Jolie and her father's hard work, Mr. Chinland lamented. He was sure that Nick, this wastrel, would squander all the property within a few years. However, the elderly man was at a loss on how to broach such a delicate subject with his goddaughter, who until yesterday emanated health and youth, and now had no chance. She was dying, and it would happen very soon. The countdown was down to weeks. Nick was already rubbing his greedy hands, his eyes burning with anticipation of getting rid of his sickly wife and acquiring solid capital. It seemed to him that the matter was in the bag. Mr. Chinland prayed that he would not have to start a conversation about the will himself, but fortunately, it was not necessary. Jolie started the conversation herself, revealing a secret plan that left him speechless because she had meticulously planned everything with finesse and ruthlessness. He never expected that revenge is truly a dish best served cold, and Jolie executed it flawlessly. The plan Jolie devised and realized didn't take much effort or time, but in completing her journey on Earth, she achieved her main dreams. Unfortunately, Jolie's loved ones did not witness a miracle, and she passed away without recovering. Before her death, she arranged the details of her funeral with great care. Serene and resolute, she conveyed her final wishes. The day after the farewell ceremony, the notary called the people mentioned by Jolie in her will and asked them to arrive for its announcement. Nick was shocked by this news. He was sure that his wife had not drawn up any official document in case of her death, and he would become her sole heir, as the law usually provides in such cases. Still hoping for the best, he went to the appointed meeting, taking his new mistress, Shirley, who was a striking beauty. Upon entering the notary's office, Nick spotted Mr. Chinland and Jolie's friend, Kurt, her son, but what caught him off guard was that Kurt wasn't alone. He was pushing a stroller with a baby boy inside. Nick was completely unaware of Kurt's marriage or the birth of the child. Although Nick wasn't an expert in any field, he certainly wasn't foolish, and it didn't take him long to realize that there was a hidden agenda at play and that he had been outsmarted. Despite this, curiosity overwhelmed him, and he wanted to know what Jolie had devised, even though it was already evident that it would be incredibly humiliating for him. For approximately 15 minutes, everyone remained silent, occupying different corners of the room. No one else arrived. The notary seemed to have deliberately prolonged the introductory part as much as possible, telling them why they had gathered, what an honor it was to read the deceased's last will. The notary announced, with a wicked grin lingering on Mr. Chinland's face that hinted the will's contents were no secret to him or the others. Finally, Nick heard his name. "To my lawful husband Nick, I deny the inheritance," read the notary. After delivering this modest and short sentence, the notary looked at Nick and asked if he had understood its essence. The humiliated man had no choice but to nod. At that moment, Shirley took his hand, attempting to leave defiantly, but Nick held her in place, ignoring her questioning look. He wanted to leave the scene of his public humiliation as quickly as possible, but the play was not over, and the invited audience needed to see it through to the end. After a brief pause, the notary continued, "I bequeath all my personal property to my only son, Robert Turgis, until he reaches adulthood. I appoint his father, Kurt Turgan, and Mr. Chinland as guardians and administrators of his estate." A shocking revelation hit Nick like a gut punch. What? A son from Kurt. His patience shattered, and he burst out with a surprised scream. Other than Nick and Shirley, the news didn't come as a surprise to anyone present. Is the boy Jolie's biological child? Nick gasped for breath, raising his voice. Yes, Robert is the biological son of Jolie and Kurt, clarified Mr. Chinland. She hasn't been pregnant in the last 2 years. That's impossible. Nick desperately clutched at straws, despite realizing that nowadays, being pregnant wasn't necessary to have a child. The godfather smirked, clearly relishing Nick's shock and disappointment. The advancements in medicine these days are astounding, he remarked, looking at this scene. Kurt remembered the horror he felt 2 years ago when he discovered that his best friend was seriously ill, with little chance of recovery. It was shocking to him how calmly she spoke about her limited time and what she needed to do. That's when she revealed her desire to become a mother no matter what. I had my eggs preserved before starting treatment. I was told that I probably wouldn't be able to conceive my child, but I insisted, Kurt. I grew up without a mother, and I know it isn't easy, but I always felt her love and protection. Does Nick agree to raise the child alone? Kurt cautiously inquired. Who would allow him? I would gladly become a guardian and use the baby's money, as he lacks conscience, Jolie replied. No, I've already realized that my dear spouse is someone of questionable character, to put it correctly. And his reaction to my diagnosis and prognosis, I don't even want to speak about him. This man isn't worth getting upset about. And what about the baby? That's what I wanted to discuss with you. Jolie hesitated, which was quite unusual for her since she was usually fearless. I don't know how to broach the subject delicately. Maybe there is no delicate way. In short, I would like you to be the father of my child, she exclaimed in a high-pitched voice. Are you joking? You have a husband, Kurt replied, clearly caught off guard. Yes, I do have a husband, and I will have him until the day I die. I've already made that decision, Kurt. Of course, we won't sleep together. It's impossible given my current condition. I can't carry the baby myself. Unfortunately, I had my eggs preserved. Now we need biological material from the future father. Naturally, I also need a woman to carry and give birth to him, but luckily, such services are available now. At first, Kurt thought it was absurd, the nonsensical ramblings of a desperate woman. Yet, she had an entire logical plan in her head, and it turned out that she had already completed a significant amount of preparatory work, researched the legal aspects, arranged for reproductive clinic services, and even found a mother for the future baby. Kurt, I could use the services of a donor for the father of the baby. I want to leave a piece of myself behind. But when you think about it, who will the baby be with? I've been thinking a lot, but you're the only one I can rely on. I am sure of you. Knowing you for so many years, I believe that you will be a great father. I understand that you want to create your own family, get married, and have children naturally. It's logical. But please think about it. Don't answer me right now. For me, after what happened with Nick, the father of my child must be someone who doesn't prioritize money, someone who won't exploit my assets. I'm not as naive as I was before marriage. Nick taught me a lot. Now I have a lot of life experience. As for you, you don't need any money at all. You have plenty, Jolie replied, correcting Jolie's reasoning for the first time. You know you're going to get it. You work tirelessly to keep the family company thriving. You've never been needy. Now I know for a fact that a man who grew up poor will never stop thinking about having enough to eat. And if his decency is also lacking, there will be a big problem. I have experienced that firsthand, the woman sadly added. To be honest, I'm completely confused. I had an entirely different idea of becoming a father. I need to consult my parents. Understand that I can't make such a decision alone. I will need the help of close family members when I become a father, so I have to inform them and ask for their opinion. Jolie had no objection, so she only requested that Kurt promise to keep the information a secret. The conversation with Kurt's parents was very difficult. His father neutrally accepted everything that was said, listened to all the explanations, and assured him that he would support his son's decision and would help as much as he could with his grandchild. His mother, however, was not as open-minded. Like all mothers, she wanted him to marry a good woman and have children together. She felt immense sympathy for Jolie. She had known her from childhood and thought highly of her. But this request, it was very difficult for a mother to accept that her potential grandchild's mother was dying and that the child would be carried by another woman. Can't the child get the disease? The woman dreaded this question, finding it awful, awkward, and out of place. However, how else could she ensure her grandson's safety? Jolie does not have a hereditary form of the disease, Kurt answered. This reassured the anxious woman to some extent, though not completely. Nevertheless, after careful consideration, she expressed her support for her son's decision. Kurt himself also struggled with indecision. Jolie's proposal caught him off guard, but after a period of contemplation, he concluded that there was no reason to refuse. When he conveyed his approval to Jolie, she was overjoyed, and they began implementing her plans step by step. While Kurt sat and reflected on the life-altering story, Mr. Chinland reminisced about the conversation with Jolie a little over 2 months ago. Starting from afar, she said that she honored Mr. Chinland as a second father and hoped he wouldn't refuse. Then she blurted out that she wanted him to become the guardian of her son. Initially, Mr. Chinland thought his goddaughter was delirious. But as Jolie shared the full story, the godfather was left in shock. Not only had Jolie and Kurt made such a bold decision, but they had also hidden it for so long. "How old is the baby now?" Mr. Chinland asked. "Robert is 8 months old," Jolie smiled. "You both truly know how to surprise." Mr. Chinland explained, still processing the shock. "I don't want Nick to find out about the child before I die. He will only find out when my will is announced. I've already had it drafted and it's held with the notary. However, there's one aspect that still needs to be resolved. Robert will have only one parent. I've reassessed many aspects of my life, and I don't want to leave anything to chance. Kurt has parents, so if anything were to happen to him, Robert would go to them. But I want you to have rights too, just in case." Being good at understanding people, the elderly man sensed that it could be too dangerous to act with Nick like this, even though Jolie's husband fully deserved such treatment. "Jolie, are you sure that this is the way to treat your husband? He's a repugnant man. Involving oneself with his means, why do you need such vengeance from beyond the grave?" He expressed his thoughts, then immediately stopped himself. "Sorry, dear, for being so rude. You know, I've pondered this for 2 years. I witnessed Robert's birth, saw how Kurt loves him, and his parents adore him. I require nothing else. I have accepted the situation. Currently, I am much more annoyed by those who speak to me about some miraculous recovery and healing. As for Nick, I loved him so deeply, I believed in him with all my heart, but he turned out to be the most ungrateful beast. He comes to my hospital as if it were hard labor. Do you know his girlfriends brought him here?" The elderly man silently nodded, bitterness apparent in his expression. "And I should forget this? Not. He cherishes money above all else, so that's how I will punish him. It will be a surprise for him, you see. I kept everything from you. It was immensely difficult. I wanted to introduce you to my son right away, but I was exceedingly cautious so that no one would accidentally find out and tell Nick. This may be my farewell to him. I even wrote him a letter the notary will deliver." Mr. Chinland made several attempts to dissuade his goddaughter. It seemed to him like an ill-advised decision. Yet, the woman maintained her stance, and he had to concede. After all, it is her final will. It deserves to be respected. Amidst the sudden silence in the notary's office, everyone was engrossed in their thoughts. Of course, you don't need to be a fortune teller to guess that Nick cursed Jolie in every possible manner. People like him have no inkling that they might be to blame and that others' behavior could be a perfectly logical response. Yet, such introspection is too complex for such people. Why bother searching for problems within oneself? Strangely enough, it was Shirley who interrupted the silence. She tried to take her lover by the elbow to lead him out. However, Nick had no intention of leaving as he had not finished speaking. "Are you sure that I'm not entitled to anything at all, a mandatory share or whatever it's called? I am the husband, after all," the man shrieked. Even Shirley winced at such behavior, let alone the others present. Only the elderly notary, accustomed to such conduct, remained unsurprised. According to the will, you are not included in the circle of persons entitled to a mandatory share in the inheritance. Moreover, I carefully studied your marriage contract. Its text is attached here. The notary patted the thick folder in front of him with his hand. You have no chance, even when appealing to the courts, although you naturally retain the right to such an appeal. I will dispute it. It's unclear who this illegitimate child is. Nick went on a rampage and didn't realize what he was saying. Kurt struggled to restrain himself from punching the arrogant man. Even the usually calm Mr. Chinland flushed in anger. Only the notary remained as calm as a python. For him, this was a typical workday, and nothing was surprising. He calmly responded, attached here are not only the child's birth certificate, but also medical documents providing clear answers about his birth. Furthermore, as per the deceased's request, DNA examination results confirm that your wife is the biological mother of Robert Turgan. I should inform you that all documents have been gathered completely and thoroughly. Can I see? Nick wanted to see the evidence. No, you can only review the part that pertains to you. All other documents, especially those regarding the child, can only be disclosed with the parent's consent, of course. I do not permit it, Kurt immediately interjected. So it's possible only in a court proceeding if the court deems it necessary to demand these documents. This was the final straw for Nick. He stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him, vowing not to let this matter rest. His mistress, however, was more polite. She said goodbye and left quietly, closing the door behind her. Does it matter that he didn't sign that the will was read to him? Mr. Chinland asked the notary. There are many like him. It's nothing more than a formality, the notary reassured him. It would be funny if it weren't so sad. I still don't understand how Jolie got involved with him, Mr. Chinland said his thoughts aloud, but his question remained rhetorical. The men quickly signed the necessary documents and shook hands. Mr. Chinland helped Kurt put little Robert into the stroller. Will you join us? I want to take a walk and get some fresh air, and it's good for the baby, Kurt asked. Certainly, I'll join for a while, Mr. Chinland agreed. They walked in silence, listening to the rustle of the roller wheels. Do you think Jolie would be satisfied with how I'm coping? Kurt finally asked, voicing what had been bothering him. I'm sure of it. You're a wonderful father, and it's clear to see how much you both mean to each other, Jolie's godfather reassured him. To be honest, there's one thing I can't get out of my head. You know, I think Jolie told you that I advised her against what just happened at the notary's office. Are you talking about the circus with the will and how Nick found out about Robert? Mr. Chinland nodded in response. Of course, Kurt replied. I was the one who constantly brought up the conversation about that. I didn't like this idea from the very beginning. He's a nasty type, angry, stupid, and mercenary. Why provoke him? Honestly, I even contemplated telling him when the baby was already born that Jolie was hiding it. So much I believed I had no right to. I decided that she just didn't want to deal with him herself and left these disputes to us. Today I saw him with that woman, showing no shame at all. Now I question whether I did the right thing by not insisting on my stance. His reaction, the expression on his face, it was horrifying. It would have been better to get rid of him earlier. I think Jolie didn't want to either. That played a part too. And revenge. She wanted revenge because she loved, regardless of what she said later. She loved intensely, and this corrupted love found no other way out. My poor girl, the elderly man wiped a tear trickling down his cheek. Don't grieve for her. She asked us not to. She asked us to direct all our love, which was for her, to Robbie. Kurt comforted Jolie's godfather while the men reminisced. Meanwhile, Nick and Shirley watched from the car, discussing the same topic. So, you won't get anything at all, right? The girl asked in disbelief, blinking rapidly. You're such a fool. You've heard that there are no chances because of this finding. Okay, let's go. We need to take at least something valuable and move it to my apartment. 3 days later, Kurt finally mustered the courage to visit Jolie's house, only to find it empty. He had braced himself for a confrontation and even bought 2 security guards for his protection. But Nick got it right and went back to his place, of course not forgetting to take with him plenty of valuables. Now, Nick was sitting alone in the small kitchen of his tiny apartment, nursing a bit of whiskey Shirley had left him, which was quite expected. Why would she need a beggar man? Nick pondered his current situation. He couldn't help but reflect on how he had ended up here. Before, women used to pay him to be with him, but now he needed to offer money to a young, beautiful girl to stay in her company. Ironically, Nick, a gigolo past his prime who deteriorated due to his vices, didn't blame himself for his circumstances. In his thoughts, his wife was the villain who had drained his vitality and dashed his hopes, leaving him without the inheritance he was so looking forward to. In his fantasies, he was young, handsome, successful, and extremely wealthy. But as a parting shot, Shirley had told him some harsh truths. No one needed him. He was just a poor drunkard living in delusions of grandeur. It was very difficult to come to terms with that reality. His dreams of wealth and success, largely contingent on his ex-wife, crumbled like a house of cards. His aspirations to be a successful businessman were dashed. Blinded by his ego, he failed to see his part in his downfall. Instead, he blamed his deceased wife. In his mind, Nick saw himself as a saint who never left his sick wife's side, conveniently overlooking his endless intrigues, gambling, alcohol abuse, and dismissive behavior toward his wife. What a pity that she's dead and I can't hit her, he thought so many times. I barely restrained my impulse, encouraging myself that my patience would be generously rewarded. Nick spent nearly 2 weeks in a drunken stupor, seeking escape from reality, and his resentment grew stronger each day. During one bleak, hangover-filled morning, he decided he had had enough. He realized that he wouldn't achieve success or revenge on Jolie by drinking. Nick felt deeply humiliated. A few days prior, men from Mr. Chinland had arrived and practically forced him to hand over his car keys, tearing up the power of attorney Jolie had given him. Didn't you know the power of attorney loses its legal force after the death of the person who issued it? One of the men said in a derogatory manner. Now sobering up, Nick began to ponder how he would like to take revenge on Jolie and what he should do next. At first, he wanted to desecrate her grave, but then, contemplating what was dear to Jolie and what harm would cause her the most suffering, he saw another answer. Lying on the surface was Robert. Nick was struck by electricity when this idea came to his head. He laughed viciously, having finally devised his revenge plan. Of course, there were many issues to resolve and structure, but he had decided on the main thing. He was not going to hurt Robert. What's a mother's worst nightmare? Not being able to help her child in trouble. That's precisely what he decided to do. The plan of his inflamed imagination was simple: to kidnap the baby, take him far away, and leave him at an orphanage. After a week, thoughts of revenge and fantasies of it warmed Nick's soul, if he had one, of course. He hadn't smiled like this for a long time. True, such a grimace looked rather intimidating and scary, but Jolie's husband didn't care at all. You could even say that he was happy as he thought through all the details. He experienced euphoria. The object of his hatred was not nearby, but Nick eagerly imagined how Jolie would have suffered from her inability to help her child. Once he had settled on a plan theoretically, he began to think about the practical side. He needed to find out everything about Robert's movements and those with whom he left the house to perfectly select the place and time for his crime. Nick had known Kurt well in his past and was even familiar with his parents, having visited their house. He also knew that their elite suburban settlement had enhanced security. As Nick began to contemplate his plan, he realized the challenges. Nick was determined to proceed with his plan despite the challenges he would face. He spent days observing from the forest with binoculars, studying the child's daily routine and movements. Is the game worth the candle? Nick reasoned with himself. Absolutely. His mental state had noticeably deteriorated after the announcement of the will. She ruined my life, and I will ruin the life of her child, he muttered with a malicious laugh. If an indifferent person had been near Nick at that moment, they would have noticed the drastic changes in his demeanor and perhaps urged him to seek help. Unfortunately, history doesn't entertain hypotheticals. Nick was relentless in achieving his goals. Once he had a plan, no matter how foolish it seemed, he saw it through to the end. He spent days preparing the necessary conditions, scouting the entire territory to find the perfect vantage point overlooking the turgid house while remaining hidden. For over a week, Nick rose at dawn and hurried to the cottage settlement, remaining there until late evening, keeping a constant watch with binoculars and meticulously recording every activity in the house. He diligently maintained a notebook to ensure he didn't miss anything. Through his observations, Nick learned that the child was cared for by Kurt's grandmother and a nanny. However, Kurt and his mother were unsuitable for implementing Nick's plans. They both knew him well and could identify him immediately. Nick had no intention of being caught or punished for the crime he was plotting. Nick meticulously planned his attack, anticipating that the police would come to him with questions, but hoping to wave them away. In his plan, the nanny was chosen as the victim of the attack. She had a fixed schedule and always walked with Robert in the same locations along the same routes. Fortune favored Nick on a Wednesday during the nanny's daytime walk with a peacefully sleeping baby. She left the secured territory of the settlement, following a small forest path to a clearing where another nanny from a nearby settlement met her. They conversed, and Nick even heard their laughter. To avoid attracting attention, Nick decided to stop watching the settlement daily and only visited on Wednesdays, trying to coincide with the nanny's daytime walk. Everything was precise like clockwork. Each Wednesday, the nanny would leave the safety of the settlement and walk the forest path for 4 consecutive Wednesdays. He observed the system to ensure it did not fail on the 4th Wednesday. He knew he would return the next week at the same time to take away the child to execute his plan. He purchased a powerful stun gun from a local market, paying cash to avoid being traced. He meticulously planned every detail to avoid capture. Similarly, he brought an old car, stole license plates, and attached them to the vehicle. He strategically determined where to park the car so it was close enough to escape, but not so near as to attract attention. He also considered his appearance, taking steps to disguise his figure and face to avoid recognition. Thoughts of kidnapping consumed him. He went to sleep and woke up with these thoughts, even dreaming about the act in precise detail. As the appointed day approached, he lost nearly 7 kilos and became a mere shadow of his former self. A glance at him was enough to realize this was a man to be feared. Traces of neurosis and obsession began to etch themselves onto his face. On Wednesday, he parked in a pre-selected spot and waited. As he saw the nanny pushing the stroller down the path, he trembled. The extensive planning had disconnected him from the reality of his impending actions. He was about to confront a stranger, assault her with a stun gun, snatch the child from the stroller, and flee to his car. Nick had imagined the situation to be different, more like a scene from a video game. Here, however, everything was real: the woman, the baby in the stroller, and the baby examining his surroundings with curiosity. By nature, Nick was not violent, and crossing that line was difficult for him. But his deep-seated hatred for Jolie drove him to carry out his plan. He approached the boy's nanny, pushed her away from the stroller, and knocked her down. He then used a taser on her, and she passed out from the shock. All that was left was to take the child out of the stroller and run to the car. However, things went awry at this point. As he bent down to unfasten the belts, suddenly he felt a blow to his head and fell to the ground. The next thing he knew, an elderly man was standing over him, scolding Nick and tying his hands. Nick lost consciousness again. The mysterious man turned out to be a gamekeeper who was well known in the nearby elite communities. His guardhouse was practically in the middle of 2 neighboring settlements, often concealed behind dense greenery and unnoticed by Nick that day. Mr. Mayo had been returning from the local store when he noticed suspicious activity. He later explained to the police officer, "I saw someone standing guard, dressed entirely in black despite the morning heat." I decided to watch a little and investigate. Due to his many years as a gamekeeper, Mr. Mayo was adept at moving silently through the forest to avoid alarming the wildlife. He hid behind a tree and kept a watchful eye. Suddenly, I saw a man attack a woman, knocking her down. I initially thought that he intended to assault her, but he was trying to reach the child. I rushed over and hit him with a stick I had picked up just in case, Mr. Mayo explained. "Good job, Mr. Mayo. You've become a local hero. Look, the The press is already gathering. They want to interview you. Sign this police report and bask in your newfound fame, said one of the officers. No, I won't go to them. I don't care for that sort of thing, replied the gamekeeper, quietly walking back to his place in a roundabout way so that no one would follow. Mr. Mayo didn't feel he had done anything extraordinary. He believed anyone would have acted similarly in his position. How could he not assist when those who couldn't defend themselves were in danger? A few hours later, Kurt appeared at Mr. Mayo's house. Hello, I am the father of the boy you rescued today. He's a good kid. He calmed down as soon as I picked him up. Such a brave and intelligent-looking boy. Thank you so much. It's a blessing you were there at the time. We're so grateful you didn't just pass by, Kurt said, on the verge of tears, overwhelmed with emotions. The day had been incredibly intense, leaving him emotionally shaken. Tell me, how can I thank you? What are you talking about? There's no need to thank me. Who keeps score when a child's life hangs in the balance? Mr. Mayo was genuinely surprised to be thanked for his actions. Nevertheless, Kurt persisted. Well, if you insist, a new hunting suit and maybe some food for my dog would be appreciated. Of course, no problem, Mr. Mayo replied. By the way, if you don't mind me asking, was all this done for money? Asked the curious gamekeeper. Oh, sadly, it's much more complicated than that, replied Kurt. Well, feel free to share if it's not too much trouble. I live somewhat isolated here in an information vacuum, so to speak, Mr. Mayo encouraged. Kurt began to recount the disjointed events of their past years, including Jolie's illness, their unconventional parenting decision, her subsequent death, and the ensuing revenge against her husband. The investigator informed me that Nick was deeply hurt. As everyone assumed his actions were solely driven by greed, he was consumed by revenge, Kurt explained. Kurt was relieved that Mr. Mayo had inquired about this complex story. He had been eager to share it with someone, seeking an unbiased perspective from an outsider. He questioned if they had driven Nick into a state of madness and revenge. And if it were just about himself, Kurt wouldn't suffer so much reflexivity, but everything he and Jolie did went back to their boy, Kurt added. After concluding his story, Kurt turned to Mr. Mayo, an impartial observer, and asked, "Do you think we pushed him to this point? Are we responsible for his entire desire for revenge?" Oh boy, are you serious? You're an adult, and you're talking such nonsense. That Nick of yours always found a reason. He doesn't even need one. He married for money, cheated shamelessly, mistreated his sick wife, and convinced himself it was all her fault. What's her fault for retaliating once, for losing patience, for not enduring it? Oh, she hit the most painful thing for him, the wallet. On the contrary, well done. The woman has thought up such a plan and put it into practice, Mr. Mayo responded with a harsh truth from a stranger's perspective that truly uplifted Kurt. Kurt deeply pondered every word Mr. Mayo had said. Now I also owe you for your good advice, Kurt smiled in response. The gamekeeper merely waved his hand at him, and they parted as friends. Mr. Mayo promised to check in on the boy. I heard somewhere that the Chinese have this belief or wisdom, God knows what to call it, that if you save someone's life, you're responsible for that person forever. So don't worry about your Robert. I'll look after him here too, the gamekeeper said as a farewell. True to his word, he regularly visited Kurt's house and was always a welcome guest. In him, the boy found another loving family member. Meanwhile, the court sentenced Nick to several years of imprisonment. During this lengthy period, everyone in the house managed to calm down and return to their usual quiet life. The family could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Mr. Chinland regularly visited and babysat the boy, diligently fulfilling the duties assigned to him by his goddaughter. Kurt met a single mom whose daughter attends the same kindergarten group as Robert. The children get along well, and Kurt's parents hope that this time, their son's personal life will flourish, and Robert will have a loving stepmother and sister, perhaps even more than one sister. But, of course, as Kurt promised Jolie, he will never allow Robert to forget his mother. He always talks about her, showing the boy pictures and videos, constantly reminding him that his mother loves him very much and she is always with him, protecting and watching over him, even if he can't see her.